I'm Dorcas the Pig, and I'm going to take you on a brush trail round Diss, starting from the Corn Hall. Here at the boiler house, you can find the face of the old boiler from the brush factory. How about you take a look at these amazing street interviews?
I'm joined by Paula, who used to work in the brush factory. Can you tell us anything?
I started there in 1969 when I first left school, and I worked in the invoice department with Mrs. Kemp and a lady called Pam. And we used to type all the invoices up. When the reps brought all of their orders in, we'd type the invoices up so they got sent to the customers.
Do you have any funny memories about the brush factory?
Yes. Pamela and I used to watch Top of the Pops on a Friday night, so when we got back to work on the Monday, we'd start singing all the songs. But the lady next door didn't like it. She used to bang on the wall and tell us to be quiet. Poor Miss Pike, she didn't like us singing. No, that wasn't funny. But no, there's quite a few of us there. I remember watching how the doormats were made out of the quiet, very dusty job. And used to how the brushes were made, how they used to pick the bristles and dip them into tar and put them into the wood. All very fascinating. But then I used to go back to where I worked, a nice, safe little office. And I earned £5 a week. And after deductions, I got £4.17 and threepence.
My father was works manager from somewhere in the mid to late 50s through till his retirement. He started work there when he was 14 as an errand boy, and he studied at night school. He did some work to learn engineering and maths and things like that because he didn't have the opportunity to stay on at school. I think when he was offered works manager, that was a bit of an improvement in terms of his salary, but life was different then. They would also play engineers' tricks such as riveting large discs like medals through, say, a buttonhole in clothing, so that when you picked it up it weighed a huge amount and it would be very difficult to remove as well. So yes, I had one tour of the factory and it was very noisy. Bands, belts, driving machines everywhere. It was quite a complicated setup. But one of the most dangerous things that my father recounted was must have been sometime in the 50s, and there was a travelling salesman. Maybe he was a paint salesman. I don't know what his role was, but he came in smoking, as people often did, all the time. I expect there was a ban in the factory because they had flammable materials. They used pitch, I think it was, for setting the bristles in the brooms, and they used cellulose paint, put big vats of cellulose paint for dipping the brush heads in, which was highly flammable. And this man came into one of the areas where the cellulose paint was in a big vat, and it obviously was sort of giving off kind of chemical fumes. So he was told to put his cigarette out, and he said, "Oh no, it's not a problem, it won't, nothing, it's safe enough." Sort of waved his cigarette over the top and it caught fire. So as far as I know, this was not one of the big fires, I think. So from somewhere, my father obtained a stuffed stork or crane, and around the time, you have to realise this was probably 1920s, in Victorian times, a lot of people had stuffed, they had taxidermy, stoats, weasels. It was quite the fashion to have stuffed animals at home. And so where my father got this bird from, I do not know, but it was a stuffed, tall bird, looking a bit like a stork. So he decided that he would play one of his jokes. So he stood this bird onto a kind of raft of wood and floated it on the surface of a water tower. There's a water tower, and whether it was the Diss water tower, in my imagination it was the Diss water tower, but I don't think he'd have had access. I think there may have been a fire safety water tower on the factory site. It might be worth finding out. But he floated this bird on its raft on the water tower and on a water tank. And as the water level changed, the bird would sort of, its head would, as the water was used, the bird would disappear as the water level was low, and then when the water level came back up, this bird would appear again, which convinced people who noticed it and were watching it that it was flying in and out and probably nesting, and it moved around as well, so it was, you know, it probably looked different from one moment to the next. So the head would pop up at different times of day, and this excited all the bird watchers who were convinced that he was a rare arrival from Europe, I believe, according to family law. I believe there was a report in the local paper about this bird on the water tower. So I think my father decided a joke was a joke and it was time to remove it before too many bird watchers invaded Diss to come and see this stork on the water tower.
As I say, I just knew these three people well who worked there. Mr. Harry Ward, who worked there for many years, and he lived to be over 100. And Mr. Harry Rice, and he lived and departed there a matter of a couple of years ago, and he lived to be 96. And also Mr. Tom Potter, who lived on Shelfhanger Road. It was a key place and employed the most people in the town, or in this area, you know, the Diss, in Diss, yes.
Did people come from far to go to
Well,
work there?
no, there weren't the transport then, so people biked to work and walked to work. Well, it was the main employer in the town. And the next largest employer in the town would have been the co-op. I had been there and walked round, but then I believe only on just the one occasion, was shown round as a schoolboy. And we saw them producing the brooms, etc., which were made there, and saw them making the, as I say, the carpets. Well, yes, it had a friendly approach to it, the people, oh yes. Oh, definitely. A major feature in the town. Oh, yes, as I say, the largest employer in the town. Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And that was employing, one would think, somewhere in the region of, 80 people. Oh, yes. And they had a siren which went first thing of a morning and at dinner times. At 8 o'clock, with the people, for working, and dinner hour. Siren used to go at 1 o'clock and again at 2.
This one might have been one of the ones that your sister-in-law made, because it's got that sort of tar that they stick the bristles in with.
How important was that in the
Well,
town?
just my sister-in-law working there, yeah. She actually did sticking the bristles into the wood part of the brushes. Yeah.
So what did that, was that more of a...
All kinds of brushes. No, it was full employment, yeah. Yes, she worked there for a long time. I think they probably have all women on the one floor. I don't really... the biggest part I remember when that started to be pulled down. I didn't understand why. I can't remember what brushes I had, actually. We used... See, the thing is, when plastic was taking over, that some of these brushes that I've seen today are beautiful things, they really are. Sort of natural wood and bristles, and the coconut matting, which Dennis mentioned. Yeah, my mum had that, and the dust and dirt used to go through that. So, yeah, it did, really. It was hard wearing. Everything had to last. I think a lot of the memories we would have after the war was replacing things. What we had to make it last. And we didn't really have the high wages years ago to replace things. I think we took care of things a lot more.
When I was little, we went on a school trip to Aldrich and Bryant's brush factory. I think I was probably about 7 years old, and it was with my junior school. And it was amazing because it was full of smells that I can even just about remember. Coconut matting and wood being turned into brush heads on a lathe. And men and women, that was what was always amazing. Everybody was wearing wonderful cotton overalls. And I remember a guy on a lathe turning wooden bottles very quickly, just by eye. And these wooden bottles were then split in half, and filaments of coconut matting were put into the brushes and became wooden handled, dipped in bright colours, vats of red, green, blue paint, and stripes being put on the back of the brush just to make them a little bit more distinctive. All that's been replaced by plastic from India and Asia, but the wooden objects were very beautiful, and they all, as I said, had a distinctive smell and feel to them, which is quite different from today. My grandmother used to have brushes like that, so it kind of all winds back in my memory to her days when things were made of coconut and wood, and things like coir, C-O-I-R, which is the tufts from coconut, which was useful. It didn't get thrown away, it got used, made into brown mats that you wipe the mud off your feet with. So yeah, great days and good industry. A lot of my neighbours' parents both worked in the brush factory, mum and dad. So it's and that was Wilbay Avenue, and it was quite a big business that kept employment and kept food on the table for people.
Let's take a step back in time and see where the Aldrich brothers started out their famous journey. Up above the door you can still see the inscriptions. Now I'm heading to this museum, where we've previously spoken with those who work there and volunteer there.
Well, we're actually at this museum, and we do have a small display of components that used to be part of brushes, but the brush factory of Aldrich Brothers was one of in fact the most important employer in this, and it started in 1836 just up the road here in Norfolk House Yard. If you go up there now, you'll see that a lot of those buildings are just lovely old factory buildings converted into shops. In 1899, the factory was moved to a new premises in what is now called Factory Lane. It's actually on a part of Lewis Lane. And unfortunately, in 1983, there was a major fire which destroyed most of the factory, and in 1986 it was closed entirely, and in 1993 it was demolished. Well, it looked like an invasion of the bike brigade whenever the bell went for the end of working shifts there. Nearly everybody who worked there seemed to have a bicycle. So just the whole of the lanes and around the area was swamped with bicycles. Nearly everybody living in Diss had a relative. If they didn't actually work in the brush museum, the brush factory themselves, they would have a relative who worked in there. In fact, we still get people asking, can we have a copy of that photograph that's outside the museum? My Uncle Jim is working at his machine. Favourite fact about the brush factory, I think, is just that it was the town. That was the main employer in the town. And that's, I think, is my favourite fact about it. That the product range was so extensive. I mean, we had a wonderful display last year, and there was what appeared to be an ordinary coat hanger, but it hinged in the middle, and the underside of the where the shoulders would be held up were brushes. So your coat hanger was also your clothes brush.
99% of the people who worked in the brush factory were women, because we do have evidence of more mature women working in the factory, but most of them are quite young women. But whether they're married or not, it's difficult to know. It was very hard work. It was quite dirty work. The wages were not good. Interviews show that people liked working there, but it was a hard life and the pay was not good. Health and safety did not really figure, but that's not unusual. Obviously, towards the end of the brush factory's life, which it actually closed down in 1988, towards the end there must have been health and safety, but not in the same way as we experience now. And there were numerous accidents. People know about one person who fell into a vat of blue dye and was thoroughly scalded and came out a very nice shade of blue, but not very well. We had people working in the carpentry areas that took their thumb tops off. We had people who gouged great holes in their hands because they were using very sharp tools. I mean, it was quite normal for accidents to happen, but there was very little in the way of compensation either. Young people left school at about 14. I'm talking about from after the Second World War. It was quite normal to leave school at 14 and go straight into a job. And the school leaving age was raised in the late 60s and then again in the 70s. So you couldn't leave school until you were 16 in the 70s. So, you know, you had children, what we would call children now, 14-year-olds, working in factories in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. The fire was discovered and the alarm was raised by a Mr. Merton, who was actually a brush factory worker who lived down Mount Pleasant. He saw the flames because it was dark, it was March, and it was not very dark, not very late at night, but obviously it was dark by then. And they discovered that a fire had started in one of the carpentry stores where there was lots of sawdust, there were shavings on the floor, and it was actually caused by a spark from one of the machines. But it didn't start straight away. It actually probably started in the afternoon when a stray spark set some sawdust just smouldering, just sort of beginning to get hot, and gradually over the hours other bits and pieces caught fire and up it went. And lots of fire appliances came from quite a long distance. They ran out of water, so they put a pipe down to the pond in Croft Lane. They emptied one of the water towers here, and even the next morning there were still parts of the factory that were on fire.
How did the brush factory come to start?
Well, there was a man called Mr. Robert Aldrich, and Aldrich was a very famous family in the town, very well known. If you go up to the Haywood Road Cemetery, there are loads of Aldrich graves. And the families were very important in those days, like the Aldriches and the Mannings, who were the rectors of Diss, and they sort of ran the town. But Mr. Aldrich was a grocer in St. Nicholas Street, And he used to be. He used to serve his foodstuffs in the old-fashioned way, and he would talk to customers. And some of them said to him that, "Do you know, Mr. Aldrich, you can't buy a good brush. You can't buy a brush at all in this." And this gave him the idea of creating a brush factory and matting as well, which was also in short supply. He first of all opened a factory in Shelfanker Road, and then the one where it was later on, right up in the northwest corner of the town, near the old grammar school. And lots of people would go to work there, and people were very poor at the time, so it provided a lot of work. And I did meet an old chap some years ago called Sam Bale, and he worked there. He went there in 1910 to work, and he ran home at dinner time, and he said to his mum, "What's for dinner?" And she said, "Nothing." And she said if she could get some flour later on, they'd have some bread that night. Otherwise, forget it. So that was the kind of people who were working there. So he was doing a lot for local people who were as poor as that, in giving them work and money and some sort of opportunity in life. I think people did specific jobs, and there were some which were regarded as women's work and some for men. Often the more sort of strenuous work were done by the men, and the more sort of skilled work by the women. And there would have been a kind of thing which traditionally was done by women, which went on being done. Now this goes right back to the old days of staymaking in the town. I mean, Thomas Paine, famous author of Rights of Man, he worked here as a staymaker, making corsets for ladies in the 18th century, because everybody wore corsets then. But they did have apparently their own fire appliance, and but unfortunately it was put away in a shed, and they'd piled coal up in front of the door, so they couldn't get the appliance out, and so the fire raged for quite some time before the fire brigade got there, and did quite a lot more damage than it would have done. So there wasn't much sort of health and safety in those days. The factory continued for another 20 years after that, continued to employ people and continued to be part of the landscape of the town. And the hooter was very well known, and children have told me they would go out with their to play on Wortham Ling. And Mother would say, "When you hear the hooter at 1 o'clock, you have your sandwiches. When you hear the hooter at 5 o'clock, you come home." So that was very much a part of the town, and the chimney was dominating the skyline at that part of the town. And the factory even appeared on the television after it had closed. I think it was a series, it was You Rang My Lord, or one of those sort of series. They needed an old factory, and they used the disc brush factory, which was still standing. And then finally it was demolished.
Now, let's take a look at an animation all about the fire at the brush factory. Be warned, this is all conspiracy. Let's just have a bit of fun.
On the evening of March 15th, 1968, the Aldrich Bros Brush Factory caught fire. H.G. Merton reported the fire at 11 p.m, and it was still going the following morning. 60 firefighters were called to the scene, emptying a 60,000-gallon water tower in under 10 minutes. Firefighters had to run a hose down the road to a pond for more water, and it was assumed to be an accident. The fire started as a result of an unknown spark that smouldered in sawdust, and an unfortunate lack of health and safety led to coal blocking the fire door. The building burnt down and industry never recovered.
But doesn't that seem too simple? What if that wasn't the truth? Here are 3 conspiracies to think about. Theory number 1, espionage. The Aldrich brothers weren't the only factory in the area. There was a small company, but not nearly as well known. We believe that they might be the cause of the fire. In fact, we've been told that a salesman regularly came in, spreading the ashes of his cigarette around flammable materials. So maybe a jealous rival decided to take out the Aldrich Brothers factory.
Theory number 2, free dis. During the 1900s, quality of life was awful. People were poor and half-starved. Maybe the Aldrich brothers were enslaving dis. Living in poverty, who wouldn't do anything to make some money to get food on the table? Locals would immediately be put into work in the factory after leaving school. Fed up with this lifestyle, one brave young man took the courage to free dis. quietly sneaking into the factory, lighting the fire and leaving. He would be celebrated for granting this freedom. What do you think?
Finally, we have the most outrageous claim. Theory number 3, the disc mafia. This whole thing could be a cover-up for something far more sinister. It may be absurd, but look at the evidence. During the Second World War, a carpet was sent to 10 Downing Street. Could a message have been woven into it? What about the pigs imported from China? Did they need to go through all that for a local product? Wouldn't it make sense if they were smuggling alongside the animals? Some of the brushes required coconut hair. Where was that coming from during the war? Perhaps in return for something valuable, it was being prioritised. What about the burning of the building? After all this, maybe something went wrong, and a cover-up was needed. It's strange how despite public protests the chimney wasn't saved. Nothing was, except for the boiler door. Maybe there was something more to this than meets the eye. This was all an elaborate plan to cover up the disc mafia's front. It even changed names for 5 days before turning back to cover for a change in hands. So maybe there was something in the factory that needed to be disposed of.
What do you believe? Accident? Espionage? Liberation? Or mafia?
I'm finishing my journey on the brush trail around Dis, finally on Mount Street. This was once the residence of Robert Aldrich, the grandson of the founder of the brush factory business. Robert bought the house in 1880. His son Henry Wright Aldrich and his young family were listed as residing here in 1911.